Terrific. So maybe what we can do, because we do need to stop, have a hard stop at 10:20 because there are other panels going on. So let's start, and I'll just keep admitting people who are coming in a little later. So I wanted to welcome everybody to this session of Carter School's Peace Week. And I am thrilled that we are able to discuss Sukanya Podder's new book that just came out in 2022 on Peacebuilding Legacy, Programming for Change and Young People's Attitudes to Peace. And it's a fascinating book. I hope everybody who's participating has a chance to read it. And I also wanted to introduce everybody. So welcome to those who are participating. I am Agnieszka Paczynska, and I'm a professor at the Carter School. We are joined here today by the author of the book, Sukanya Podder, who's a reader in post-war reconstruction and peace building at King's College in London, and she is a long-term specialist and a researcher and a practitioner working on issues of humanitarian assistance as well as post-conflict peace building on issues related to rebel groups and child soldiers, processes of demobilization following cessation of hostilities. Her work has also taken her to many places in the globe, including the two that she will be talking about today, Macedonia and Sierra Leone. She has also worked with the UN and various peacebuilding international non-governmental organizations in the Middle East, across Africa, as well as in Asia. And she has published extensively on her findings in journals such as Civil Wars, International Peacekeeping, Peacebuilding, Third World Quarterlies, Conflict, Security, and Development, among many others. So we were thrilled that we will be able to hear from Sukanya about her findings in this study. We are also joined today by two other participants who will offer their comments on the book manuscript that book that Sukanya will be speaking about. Patricia Moulden is professor of conflict resolution at the Carter School and the director of Dialogue and Difference Project at the school, as well as the student engagement coordinator. And she has worked extensively on issues of peace building, child soldiers and their reintegration into society after cessation of civil wars. She has worked on issues of demobilization and reintegration, as well as other aspects of youth and peace building and conflict resolution processes, including in Sierra Leone. So we're thrilled that she's able to come in and offer her comments. She has also worked in other parts of Africa, including Ethiopia and Burundi, as well as in Latin America, including Brazil and Colombia. Finally, we are joined by Jason Calder, who is director of Saferworld USA, which is the USA branch of Saferworld, which is an international peace building NGO. He has extensive experience working on peace building, on issues of conflict sensitive development and conflict prevention. He has worked across countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, both with Saferworld, as well as other organizations, including the Carter Center, as well as U.S. Institute of Peace. So we are thrilled that they are able to join us and offer comments. So the way we're going to organize this is that Sukanya will lead us off and present her findings that she has published in the book Peacebuilding Legacy, and then Patricia and Jason will offer their comments on this really fascinating study, and Sukanya will have a chance to respond to those comments, and then we will open it up for question and answers from the participants in this panel, the audience in this panel. If I can ask those of you who are participating as audience members, if you could make sure that you are muted. I will also ask everybody else who's not speaking on the panel to also mute ourselves as Sukanya is speaking, just to reduce the number of sort of noises and that can come up as in our backgrounds that can be quite disturbing. So thank you so much for joining us, Sukanya. We're thrilled that you are able to present your findings, and take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, Jason, Patricia, for being here and, for sharing your knowledge and reflections, having worked in so many different parts of the world. And there must be overlaps in terms of some of our understandings and reflections on this. So I'll just kind of summarize the key points that have arisen from this book. It's taken me a really long time to write this book. And I think it's because of the nature of peace-building work. We need the gestation period to really understand what we are experiencing in the field. And much of my research has been field-led, particularly in West Africa. So in terms of this book, which came out last year, I've had a little bit more time to reflect on what has been written, and perhaps there are other projects now brewing, which I will talk about shortly. But just for those who are attending and want to know a bit more about why write this book, I think it's really important as scholars and practitioners who have worked in the field to ask ourselves the question, what is the main challenge behind building peace after war, right? This is a photo from the Mandingo Quarter in Wonjama in Liberia, which was one of my first exposures to working in a post-conflict environment. And the fact is, most of us who are in peace and conflict studies recognize that a large population of people, nearly 2 billion, are living in countries which are affected by conflict. And therefore, understanding and responding to conflict through prevention efforts, through efforts at building peace, have become significant areas of international engagement. We know that billions of dollars have been invested, by the United Nations, by various donor governments, Nordic governments, for example, the United Kingdom, the US, among others, in the name of what we call peace building. But the important question which really puzzled me was that there didn't seem to be the tools or the knowledge or the systematic approach towards understanding what is the long-term effect of these various peace-building interventions that are taking place in countries recovering from conflict, because the way in which we're measuring or trying to understand the impact or effects of these are very much short-term and linked to short-term monitoring and evaluation. So that was the main puzzle. So when you look at the scholarly literature, particularly the literature on liberal peace building, there's a lot of emphasis on peace building as a dynamic process, which is gradual. It unfolds gradually over the long term, quite incremental, quite evolutionary, and often unpredictable. But the way in which we're doing or executing the work of building peace is very much time-bound. It's tied to short-term objectives, donor objectives of women's empowerment, youth empowerment, democratic consolidation, or electoral, making sure that electoral participation is one of the issues in many countries. So the effectiveness in terms of understanding the work of peace building is measured and understood through these short-term monitoring and evaluation models, which I will talk about more shortly, because the approach of trying to understand the long term through an evaluative process simply does not fit into the DNA of the peacebuilding industry. It is not how peacebuilding is funded. It is not how peacebuilding is done. And it is not how peacebuilding is studied or understood, at least from the standpoint of those who are funding peacebuilding activities, whether it's the UN, whether it's governments, whether it's donors. In fact, longitudinal studies or even follow-up research with participants of various peacebuilding projects after a project of 9, 12, 18 months closes does not seem to be built into either the narrative or the plan of various programmatic efforts. So there's often very limited time, despite the fact that large peacebuilding organizations, including the UN and its various agencies, seem to be part of the peacebuilding efforts in any given country for decades. Often there has been limited scope to actually take a pause, to look back, to turn attention to what has already been done, what is the learning, and what can we learn from the projects that have already been implemented. So there seems to be a real dichotomy between what we aspire peacebuilding to achieve in terms of transformation of conflict and how we do peacebuilding. So this brings us to this question of actually looking back and understanding the issue of legacy, right? So by peacebuilding legacy, I mean the long-term effects, at least 10 years plus, these various peacebuilding interventions, these short-term projects which are being attempted in the context of post-conflict reconstruction. I conceptualize legacy through the lens of time, transformation, and intergenerational peace. And the way in which I try to measure legacy, at least through these 2 case studies and meta-evaluation data, and I'll talk about that, is through qualitative cues, looking at norm transmission, resonance and retention, looking at organizational learning and reflection, looking at institutional handover and succession. Now, when I say time, again, going back to this idea that many of these projects are linked to Western liberal time, donor governments follow what we call bureaucratic clock time or policy time. Projects are time-bound, they are financed, and the accountability mechanisms are very much linked to a certain timeline. And there's an element of performance, tick box learning, the showing of doing, focusing on outputs, on activities, measurable kind of results that can be written up in a narrative report to the donor to communicate the results from various efforts. But when we think about transformation, and again, going back to this idea that conflict transformation is long drawn, and peacebuilding is being executed through these time-bound projects, there's this fundamental misalignment, in how accountability for our efforts in terms of peacebuilding is being sought, and the methodological tools that are available to us in terms of how we can learn from what is being done. So on the one hand, there's this aspiration towards transforming people's attitudes from violent to more peaceful ones. But the way in which we are going about peacebuilding is very much a technical short-term activity, which is focused on outputs, impact, and similar sort of narratives. And another thing which is really puzzling is that peacebuilding seems to cater to certain types of beneficiaries, whether these are women, young people, children, those who have, there's also a focus on sexual violence, there's a focus on disabled, different sort of categories, ex-combatants, a category of the population that I've worked with closely. But often what is missing is the understanding that many of these conflicts that we are responding to are long duration conflicts. They have lasted generations, which means that different generations have witnessed different phases of conflict and peacebuilding, and they also therefore have different needs and different expectations from peacebuilding. And often peacebuilding organizations and the way in which donor-funded peacebuilding works does not take into account the fact that these generational needs need to be accounted for. Therefore, when we think about intergenerational peace, it actually helps us not only think about future, the futures thinking literature, which is becoming quite prominent in peacebuilding, but also to look at the relationship between generations when it comes to conflict resolution, and how to actually have sustainable peace. So this is an important area, an area in which I will continue to work on in the future. So it's about addressing and incorporating generational needs into peacebuilding programming. So this is where I'm coming from. Now, in terms of measuring peacebuilding legacy, I've mentioned that I use qualitative cues. So I partnered up with Search for Common Ground, based in Washington, D.C. Saji wasn't able to make it today. I think he's at the UNGA. So I used 2 case studies in discussion with Saji and other members of their team, the institutional learning team. We were looking at countries where Search for Common Ground had implemented projects over 15 years, with children and young people. And we selected Sierra Leone and North Macedonia for different reasons. Sierra Leone at that time was near sunsetting. Macedonia, many of the projects were coming to a close, and there had been a handover to the national government of a peace education project. So there was interesting findings to be had in terms of succession and handover from an international organization to national government. So through this knowledge production partnership, we were able to I was able to access a lot of monitoring and evaluation data linked to these various projects that had been executed over 15 years in both countries. And I was working closely with the country teams, but also with their institutional learning team in DC. I also had a little bit of field money to go out to Sierra Leone and Macedonia and to speak to the various participants in the different programs, radio programs, primarily in Sierra Leone, and a peace education project in North Macedonia. So the method that I use is called meta-ethnographic synthesis. This is quite an interesting take on using evaluative, on how to understand the trends within evaluative data, because we often dismiss monitoring and evaluation data as not particularly useful. It's speaking to a certain narrative of a project. But it's interesting that when you look at monitoring evaluation data in the same country with the same organization or country office and the various sort of projects that they have implemented, it's possible to actually have, build a secondary analysis. This is a method that is used very much in health studies, not so much in peace and conflict studies, but I found it time-consuming, but quite a rich way in which to look at the trends in terms of project archives, in terms of understanding the institutional approaches and responses to learning and adaptation. What was the response to the monitoring and evaluative data? In some cases, you saw that changes were actually being made to the theory of change. In other cases, not so much. So it was quite an important way in which to evaluate which kind of themes were being funded, where funding was getting lost, the entire story over these 15 years in terms of how peace building work was progressing or being executed, and also internal communications and various things that I could access through their teams who were willing to share. Now, in terms of understanding the 3 cues around norm transmission, I think this is a really important element to reflect on, because the norm transmission literature is quite prominent in international relations theory, in terms of looking at conflict studies, what sort of norms are being transmitted. But in peace building, we don't sufficiently interrogate the messages that are being transmitted through various peace building projects. How far are these values that are being transmitted? In my case, I was looking at peace education, media, radio, theater projects that were being executed. How far are they actually retained by the beneficiaries after these projects close? And did the beneficiaries actually change their ideas about certain things? Did their families have different attitudes following their exposure to these normative packages, as I call them? Because I found that often when there is a deep misalignment between the type of norms that are being projected or transmitted through various peace building projects to the society in which these messages are being introduced, there is often, because of this misalignment, there's no resonance. And when there is weak resonance, there is often weak retention, because it simply does not agree with the pre-existing value systems. In terms of institutionalization adaptation, very few peace building projects, and this is not just these 2 case studies, having worked in other parts of the world as well, tend to build in an element of handover and succession, whether it is to national agencies or even to whether it is to national agencies or national governments. By agencies, I mean it could be local CSOs, like civil society organizations, which can be successor organizations once the larger peace building entity or INGO leaves. So this element of handover and succession is often weak. I'm not saying that it's completely missing. In fact, there are some advancements in this area, which I'll talk about shortly. And also whether certain models of peace building were more amenable to institutionalization or to handover compared to other models. And I found that peace education was easier compared to media projects. Now, this is the model of Peacebuilding Legacy that I have looked at in the book. I'll talk shortly about North Macedonia. Now, this is a case in the Balkans where there is intergroup conflict between the Macedonians and the Albanians. And there was a short episode of conflict, so it is not one of the bloody, more difficult conflicts like Yugoslavia. But interestingly, some of the similar issues of interethnic divide exist. But more specifically to the Peacebuilding Legacy project, one of the areas in which the European Union and other donor governments have been, let's say, throwing a lot of money in the Balkans is on intercultural communication. This includes education by encouraging bilingual sort of exposure to languages from both groups, because instruction after primary school onwards is very much segregated and monolingual. So by exposing young children between 3 to 6 years of age to both languages and customs and values and religious beliefs of the two communities, these projects, which are intercultural communication projects, tend to expose people at a very, children at a very young age to multicultural coexistence, tolerance related norms. So there was bilingual instruction. There were teachers who were speaking both in Albanian and in Macedonian. And there was this emphasis on intercultural communication. This project initially was funded by the Swedish government, later the Swiss government, and there was already a built-in idea that it would be handed over to the Macedonian government, and they would make it part of their preschool education system. So there was a very clear kind of handover and succession plan. And over time, these mosaic kindergartens, initially, they were popular because of the high quality of preschool care. So it was less about the intercultural communication because most parents were not really interested in the normative ideas that were being floated. But eventually, what happened, it became quite popular. There were long waiting lists. It expanded to various parts of Macedonia from, to 10 municipalities. There were 13 preschools, and I was able to visit several of them. And the interesting thing is that it was adopted by the government in January 2012 as part of the state's kindergarten system. So over time, nearly 1,500 children have gone through the mosaic model. But where is the dichotomy? I think the fact is, when you look at mosaic, it is only one example, and we might be able to find more examples like this, is that the transition and handover is not linear. It never is. It's not without its hiccups. And in this case, the main hiccup, and this is an important learning opportunity, is that who was going to pay for these teachers? It had to be the local government. A lot of politics around that, because then the teachers become government employees with pensions compared to being paid from a donor budget. There were even years when the teachers worked without pay. So there was a lot of politics around institutionalizing a donor project into a national government project, right? So this was quite an interesting area of the internal shocks that the mosaic model faced. But in terms of the 3 criteria around norm transmission, retention, institutionalization, learning, and reflection, I found that the theory of change of these mosaic kindergartens, and there were also a lot of media programs that I examined, like Naše Malo, which was a children's television series similar to Sesame Street, that the theory of change was anticipating that exposure to the culture and beliefs of other groups would enhance cooperation and respect, would encourage intercultural tolerance. And this was the same norm messaging that we found across the media programs like Naše Malo and theater projects like the Balkan Theater Project. And the individual rather than the family was the main target of these messages. So it was young people, children. But the monitoring and evaluation data from the very beginning was emphasizing the importance of the family. In fact, family attitudes, the geographical location of these kindergartens, the role of social capital, the dense nature of, or the nature of interactions between the different groups and the families was a major factor which was overlooked. For example, in mixed areas like Skopje, which is the capital, and Struga, the friendship networks of these children, the alumni, faded soon after they went into primary school and into segregated education. They forgot the languages, words that they had learned from the other language. In Debar, however, which is on the border with Albania, there are thick relationships between families across the intergroup divide and long-standing sort of friendships, which meant that these relationships carried on outside of school. So once they'd finished Mosaic and gone into monolingual education, it was not a problem. The other thing is that transferring this model into the primary and secondary sort of education model as an intercultural communication, allowing bilinguality, the government will not allow it, various politics, but also funding. And overall, I think education interventions such as Mosaic in these kinds of divided societies are really not politically neutral. There was a dilution in quality after the kindergartens were institutionalized into the government system. It was not practical to extend it into primary school or beyond. And without doing that, obviously the long-term effects were lost. Children went on into this monolingual segregated education pathway, and they lost the relationships and the ideas that they were exposed to when they started in Mosaic. So there were observable changes in intergroup relations, right, once they were older. And there were difficulties with dating across the intergroup lines, marriage, and things like that. So the numbers in terms of alumni are quite limited. These alumni were not really engaged till quite late in the project lifeline. So that also I found quite baffling. But overall, the appeal of integrated education and social cohesion, these concepts, they were being adopted not only through this project, but also through the government's, various initiatives, policies, legally. But they were very superficial. They were not really making a huge difference in terms of, how society was working. And also in terms of learning and reflection, the Macedonia team was less learning oriented. The institutional memory was in place because there was continuity with staff, but and they had maintained an alumni database. Often there were weaknesses with regard to follow-up, but there was very limited, I think, adaptation or response to the monitoring and evaluation data, whereas there was limited interaction with other agencies that were doing very similar kind of work, be it UNICEF or other kind of organizations. So overall, there was little critical reflection among those who were implementing Mosaic, and as to whether it was truly achievable, in a segregated schooling system, to retain these values. In Sierra Leone, however, the focus was on media and attitude change through radio programs in particular. What was adopted was a programming for change approach, and it was about changing beliefs and attitudes through behavior change communication. So it was across the individual, group, and structural levels. Overall, in terms of the radio timeline, there were lots of programs in various areas. Atunda Ainda was one of these programs, which was really long-lasting. The various themes that we could identify through these projects, whether these were children's rights, whether they were about political accountability, about governance, which I detail in the book, about democratization. But overall, in terms of norm transmission and retention, we find that the programs immediately after the civil conflict actually were much more authentic. The kind of ideas and values and norms that were being transmitted were much more resonant with the local context. Overall, there was a great deal of sensitization, and I don't quite like this word, but I'm using it because there's several scholars who have used this, is that through radio programs, awareness creation on issues like children's rights and sexual violence, on democracy promotion, electoral issues, violence during elections, all these different themes were being floated. People became aware of the positive and negative aspects of these issues, but at the same time, there was a lot of preaching. There was almost like, local population did not have their own ideas about these things. And often what happened is there was an instrumental adoption of certain ideas like children's rights or women's rights, because it created greater level, it leveled the playing field for groups who were previously marginalized. I, again, don't want to use this term, but were not at an equal playing field with elders, who often had gerontocratic control in a society like Sierra Leone. And they also resonated strongly with global discourses and donor discourses around rights, rule of law, governance. But it created greater problems in terms of intergenerational tensions because of power shift. Elders traditionally have been in power, and viewing the greater political participation of women and children seemed to be a challenge to their power or their respect. And often these messages, did not take into account the deeply patrimonial sort of relationship in a society like Sierra Leone. In terms of institutionalization and adoption, adaptation, I found that often, some of these projects were speaking to donor narratives, things like HIV/AIDS, countering violent extremism. These were areas in which donors were funding projects, but they were not necessarily projects which had resonance with the local society. But there were also ad hoc areas, where accidental institutionalization took place. One of these is the Bike Riders Union example. And then there's also the radio-related example where, a certain association was overlooking all these community radios, which have lasted for a really long time. So in terms of learning and reflection, the Sierra Leone office was definitely more learning oriented. They made some changes to their various projects. The institutional learning memory was a bit more difficult to track, but there were also many, many projects that were being implemented. It was a large country office. And one of the issues was with handover and succession. There seemed to be a prolongation of programs because it was a relatively successful country office in terms of securing donor funds. So although the monitoring and evaluation data very early was saying that, you need to prepare a local organization for succession from headquarters, they did not want that transition to take place because it was not the best financial decision. So often these NGOs are also following, a very corporate model in terms of how they're operating. And also there was limited post-closure sort of follow-up evaluation or, looking at how to continue funding some of these areas of children's rights, of community radio. Overall, I think with attitude change with regard to media and peace education very much was linked to norm resonance dynamics, to social capital dynamics. And when there was low resonance, there was low retention. With regard to institutionalization and succession, the formal links with national governments can help civil society organizations create a stronger legacy. Less is more. I think in-depth programming over multiple years on the same theme is better than doing ad hoc projects, for 6 months, 12 months, and then forgetting about that area. Again, I can't reiterate this enough or underline this enough, is that handover to a local success organization, to a government agency is really important. And planning timely exits, follow-up research with beneficiaries is really important to gauge the long-term outcomes. And also creating a intention to learn from the projects that are being implemented, archiving the results, documenting internal communication, maintaining continuity, whether it's in personnel or it's in the focus of the programs, and planning exits early so that you build in, you have a built-in plan of succession and handover. And also following projects which are locally resonant, right, which actually sync with the values and needs and systems in a particular context, rather than importing ideas which will be resisted or not really of use. Countering violent extremism is an important area where Sierra Leone, actually, we've seen many young people calling themselves radicalized to be able to access CV-related de-radicalization programs, and that's a real problem. So learning essentially has to be internally guided. There's an internal moral compass that most peacebuilding organizations need to follow with regard to not just doing donor-funded M&E, but also sort of doing their own learning and reflection from various projects and revising the theory of change of projects in ways that can enhance the resonance and retention of the values being transmitted. There actually have been some advancements in the field since this research was conducted. There are quite a few examples of INGOs in particular, and also the UN, undertaking more longitudinal studies to learn and reflect from their performance. The IRC, for example, I know, have undertaken a study about the legacy of about their transition and legacy from their multi-decade work in Liberia, which is a very interesting report. Please do read. There's a link in this presentation. There's a Swedish organization, Kvinna till Kvinna, hopefully I'm pronouncing that properly, has released a study as well of its exit experiences from several countries that they have been working in and how they've handed over to local success organizations. So that's an important study to look at as well. The UN Peacebuilding Fund has also been undertaking portfolio evaluations, to look at areas where they have invested over many years and what have been the broader impact of these funded projects. So there is an uptake, I think, of this idea around legacy, around learning and reflection. Thank you so much for your time. I hope I did not go over time and your patience in terms of hearing me out. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sukanya. This was just fascinating discussion of the findings in your study. So I'm thrilled that we had a chance to hear about the details of what it is that you found in these two locations and the broader implications of these two cases, right? Because obviously you focus on these two, but these kinds of challenges emerge in multitude of places. If now I can turn to Patricia to offer comments on, and then to Jason.
Sukanya, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It brought back a lot of memories and thoughts. In particular, I did on the ground, walking around, very traditional kind of stuff. One of the things in terms of the child's rights introduction in the space, I heard it in Sierra Leone, and I also heard it in Liberia. Save the children, kill the parents. And I'm not sure how it transmitted from one place to the other, but there was quite a pushback from parents about child rights and the breaking of the traditional way of things. And I'm not sure if it's still going on, but in some places I would imagine it very well may be. Perhaps more outside of town, I'm not sure. But anyway, so I was a little, kind of stunned the first time somebody said it in Sierra Leone, and then in Liberia, they said it too. So that was, I don't know quite what to make of it, but that was informative. And also walking the streets of Sierra Leone and talking to regular folks and some of the amputees around the cotton tree. This was back in 2004, and then I was there in 2000, maybe 5 years later, and then 5 years later. But the idea of who got what and why. For instance, in terms of the amputees, they could walk around in those days, but now they have all been moved to an encampment outside of town so that donors don't see them. Because it is a horrible thing to see and then talk to them. And so the idea of who's making the decisions and that is more the, I think, international folks, because they want business to come in and they want that kind of, they don't want it to look bad. But yeah, so there's that. The other thing, and this was from a conversation in Liberia with some folks, but in Sierra Leone as well, the youth were picking up the slack from some of the projects that they saw as ineffective and not helpful. They were developing their own NGOs. And they were doing some really interesting work about farming in McKinney, and they were looking at women's rights, and they were looking at, so the ground up kind of actions that were probably influenced by the influx of folks right after the war, but it had that kind of a dividend where young people would say, this really doesn't work, so we're going to do it ourselves and organize it ourselves. So I found that real interesting. And the same thing in Liberia. They were doing their own reintegration projects after having gone through the UN stuff because it didn't work. So it's really, I really appreciate the work that went into this project, the years, I would imagine. That so thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Years that I could have done something else. Eh?
Yeah. Well, we could, but we don't.
We spend far too much time in front of our screens and reading. I think maybe soon, I'm hitting that age where I will be a bit more liberal with my time. But we must all learn.
Excellent.
Jason, I look forward to your comments. Thank you, Patricia. I think all the comments you made, they were just observations, so I will not respond to them per se. But
oh no, they were just observations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Jason.
Sure. So much is resonating from this. It's these panels aren't supposed to be triggering experiences, but when you kind of see you're reminded once again of just the shortcomings of the system in which we work. But thank you very much for this study, and I really do think it's going to make a contribution to the field. I really welcome it. As someone who's had the good fortune in my own career to have had deep longitudinal engagement in a particular context over 20-something years, I mean, it's great to go all over the place, but it's just such a really good reminder to go back to some of the same places over time, right? You can appreciate how transitory the impacts of development and interventions too often are. How the work of the aid sector and INGOs never kind of quite makes it to scale in terms of the kinds of impacts that are needed. How a lot of the work just doesn't integrate into the fabric of the wider social experience of a changing society. I mean, you think of how you're approached so often by folks in the context of the work you're doing, and they say, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? And the answer too often is, well, that's not in the project, right? And so the ability of our systems to really be responsive, and I'll maybe comment a little bit on that later, how these patterns are repeated in cycles over long stretches of time. I mean, I've had the unfortunate experience in places of, having gone through 10 ambassadors, 10 US ambassadors and aid mission chiefs. And unfortunately, the experience is just not getting, the institutional memory is not being transferred, and so you're sort of having the same conversations and like, boy, the system's just not picking this up and acting on it. And it's so frustrating. But also your comments on the lack of resonance of donor and NGO narratives within the local context, the challenge of altering power structures. Unfortunately, the latter is often not the point of a lot of development interventions. They're too apolitical. but being political is extremely challenging, and you have to, the sector's maybe not ready to do that well, and how too often very flawed donor country foreign policy interventions or objectives like countering violent extremism often trump all other considerations. But I think this idea of peace-building legacy can be a real contribution to refreshing our thinking on this sort of age-old problems of transformation and sustainability. A couple of things that really stood out to me. Again, this idea of challenging thinking about how our interventions are absorbed into the fabric of society in sort of real time and being more responsive. And this transfer problem, including to the government, which is often, quite challenging, and maybe appropriate or not appropriate depending on the type of intervention you're talking about. Arguing for us to be more anthropological and ethnographic in the methods we use for understanding change. Music to my ears. But how do we follow it and measure it as organizations engaged in this sector? So I want to maybe make three quick comments. I'll keep them quick given the time, around three themes that are talked about a lot right now in international peace building. The first is around conflict sensitivity and conflict sensitivity practice. The other one is decolonization and shifting power. What we're trying to see is this sort of transition of the role of aid actors, INGOs, donors, to shift more of the power, more of the thinking, more of the initiative to local actors. And then finally, sort of this question of aid system reform, coordination. But I think everyone on this call obviously knows that conflict sensitivity is about analyzing the impact of any aid on the dynamics of conflict, including sort of the post-conflict peace, if you're ever lucky enough to get there, and how you you're hoping that conflict doesn't reoccur. It's become sort of an axiom for so many of our interventions to go beyond just doing no harm and contributing to, transforming attitudes and behaviors, processes and structures in society. In theory, then, we should be thinking in our conflict analysis about peace-building legacy, right? About normative change. But I'm not sure how well equipped we are, and maybe even some of our local partners are, to bring these issues into our conflict analysis and then to act on them effectively. And so, I'm wondering about the ways in which you've maybe engaged conflict sensitivity and conflict analysis and peace building legacy. Obviously, transferring to local structures, particularly those of the state, often the state's the state is always part of conflict systems and could be perceived by, or in actuality is captured by one or another side of the conflict. And so even local organizations, local NGOs, we tend to idealize them. They're part of the conflict system, as are we. So one of the challenges with the local transfer idea and sustainability ideas, how do we do this through a conflict sensitivity lens? I think around the issue of peace building legacy can reinforce many of the arguments around decolonization and shifting power. It's because it really challenges how we in INGOs or the donor community, outsiders, look at our relationship with local partners. And really it kind of, I think, challenges what the future of the INGO should be. What does the peace building ecosystem look like in a different context? And what are the relations between all of the actors, local partners? And increasingly now there's this focus on social movements, of not just looking at the NGO structure, but looking at other forms of social movements and all of the questions of how we engage with them, how do we learn with them, I think are part of this. I wanted to mention a little bit just about Saferworld's sort of journey at decolonization, some of what we're trying to do. We've taken some steps on this. It's part of our own strategic vision. So we tend not to hop around to a lot of different countries. We tend to set up a long-term presence, always staffed by local nationals in country. But I think, we're challenging ourselves on whether that presence is even appropriate now, because no matter what you do, you're still centered in the conversation as an international organization, right? And you have all of those incentives to sustain, to fund, everything else. But we do all of our work through local partners, and we have long-term partnership compacts with them, which include investments in capacity development priorities that they set as part of their own organizational capacity assessments. We reinvest some of our overheads in our local partners. But I'd say we're not intentional about exit. And I think your study really challenges us maybe to ask some hard questions about that. We use outcome harvesting twice a year with our partners as our main learning methodology. It's really increasingly about how do we center our local partners' learning to drive program theories of change. I think the challenge for us is making sure that over time, it's those theories of change informed by the sort of ethnographic and anthropological analysis that you're talking about. I'm not sure we're there yet in terms of how that drives our thinking and change, and I'm wondering how you'd see more uptake of that in INGOs. The last thing reminds me, just in terms of attempts to get the aid system to think and learn as one. Donor agencies are so vertically integrated. Attempts at horizontal coordination are talked about a lot. I'm reminded by a World Bank official who once told me, when it comes to this topic of coordination, after all's said and done, a lot is said and very little is done. It's very superficial. And so how can the international community act more as a community in terms of thinking? One of the things that we've, you have a lot of mechanisms like cluster groups and aid coordination groups. They're all very donor-centric, very short-term focus. So how can you aspire to have the international community learn and act more on learning in a particular context? One of the, I think, innovations that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years has been through conflict sensitivity work, but are things called conflict sensitivity facilities. They are learning platforms, if you will, that help the donor community and aid actors to try to learn. It's organized around the question of conflict sensitivity, but obviously these questions of sustainability, theory of change, and all of that are certainly part of it. But these facilities are multi-year donor-funded mechanisms intended to promote knowledge generation, analysis, outreach, capacity building, in a sense, that public good for aid actors to act upon. And so we're trying to do more to engage local civil society, local academics, researchers in that knowledge creation and learning process. A lot of it is collecting all of the studies that have been done and trying to share that learning. But can we get these mechanisms? For me, what's your question? What's your study challenges? Is can we get mechanisms like this involved in asking the right question and bringing forth the right learning, even kind of commissioning the kind of work that you've done with an audience of aid actors over the long term? I'll stop there, but just to say that great piece of work, and it's really provoked a lot of thinkings. And so I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Jason. Did you want to add something, Patricia? We wanted to then turn it to
Yeah, I'm going to just
response.
do some anecdotes. One of the places I went, just lowering my hand here. One of the places I went to talk to folks about child soldiering and reentry and rehabilitation and all that sort of thing was UNICEF. And I talked to he was pretty high up in the UNICEF team that was there. And I said, so what's going on with the project and this and that? And there seems to be a lack of, and this was at the end of whatever. Anyway, there seems to be a lack of folks that are involved in young folks that are involved in these projects. And how is the outcome going to work? That was, what's going to be the end product that they have to build their future on, which was what they were promised, which was a bit of an overstatement. And he said that, well, we just want to get him to stop fighting. That was the outcome. Get him to stop fighting. Okay. So you think they're not going to pick weapons back up? And by that point, they'd already had, I would walk around town and see what militias were where and whatnot. So that was that. And then I make friends with people, with my colleagues in the hotel. And I had, it wasn't really a hotel, it was a guest house. Anyway, so they brought some folks in, not as part of the projects that people were doing, and they were trying to assess poverty levels across the country. Now, Sierra Leone poverty levels, they're everywhere. And they were spending a good deal of money on it with a lot of people involved. And a friend of mine who worked there and was a waiter said, what the hell? What is this? Because they have these really nice colored graphics about poverty levels across the country. So I'm just anecdoting it. It's about people. It's about people. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. Sukanya, I want to turn to you before opening up to other questions from the audience.
I think some of the points that, perhaps this point that Patricia was making about, just stopping the fighting, that often the approach of many of these peace-building organizations is to just make something work. And maybe it's related to not fully understanding the context, and not so much in 2023, but I would certainly think 23 years back, when in Sierra Leone, many of these organizations actually were not as exposed to conflict sensitivity or to these ideas around, doing an assessment of who the actors are and, do no harm and all these approaches. Not that they were not around, but I think they were not as well integrated into the programming approaches of different peace-building organizations. So I can completely, understand, the anecdote that you mentioned, Patricia. In terms of Jason's very important points, I think I just want to share something about decolonization, partly because, I'm an immigrant academic. I was born in India and I have now become a British citizen, if I can ever be British, but at least my passport says I am. But in short, these are ideas which are really close to my own lived experience, as being, I would always say I'm a post-colonial subject. But in short, Jason, I think this idea of handover and relying completely on local actors is also a trap, because many studies have shown that local actors are quite effective in manipulating donor agendas or their own agendas in ways that they can access funding or programs that also may not speak to local issues. So who is the local is a big challenge as to which part of the local we can actually access as international actors and foreigners, right? So which part of the local do we actually engage with? Because we might not be able to engage with the local, as Richmond says, the people who are in dire need of support. Because there are so many levels of access, whether it's the national government, which itself, as you said, is a political actor, can be a problem when there are intergroup issues involved, but also civil society. And my recent experience of working in Nigeria, I had a very negative experience of working with one of the local organizations who didn't, took the grant money, did not deliver on any of the outputs. There were always excuses. And then there was this one output which was really critical to the project. It was delivered to a standard that was just not acceptable. So all I'm trying to say is that we should not also over fantasize the local, because the local comes with a lot of challenges, and sometimes also comes with different values around integrity and performance and what really needs to change. And there are issues of access, that those in dire need of support may not even be able to access the projects and programs that we want to take to these countries, because again of these different layers in terms of who can access peace building support. So I think we need to be very careful about shifting power dynamics and decolonization, because it is not going to be a simple, or, even if it comes with altruistic ideas, it may not be as effective when we come to operationalizing it. Because often, the evil is not that international actors come in with different ideas. The evil is that international actors often may not stay long enough or may not listen carefully enough to what is required. But we also, and when I say we, I mean, aid actors also come in with definitely with some ideas of altruism and support and humanitarianism, right? Which may or may not exist in the context of the local, because everybody is fighting for their own corner of whatever they can get. So that's one thing I want to speak to. The second is about conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity. Very important, and I think it is now much more part of how programming approaches are being executed. Donors such as DFID, for example, have long involved conflict sensitivity into their, very well with Saferworld, that it's part and parcel of any project that they must do that. But also in terms of the knowledge platforms that you mentioned, which I was not aware of. Yeah, I think that's an important area to understand interorganizational learning. Because I think there is, at a global level, several organizations, including Saferworld, Search for Children, Search for Common Ground, and various other, American organizations who are actually have signed a compact. It's in the book. Now I forget the details. Have signed a compact about interorganizational learning. So there are consortiums which are at least committed to knowledge exchange. But at a local level or at a country level, I find it can get quite difficult, because several civil society actors are often vying for the same pot of funds from donors. And therefore, there is not as much willingness or openness to share about knowledge. And also there's, to be very honest, and we all have been in the field, sometimes there is a bit of fudging of results going on, with local organizations, because they may not be performing to the optimum. And they might be showing results which actually, God only knows what's going on. So sometimes we have to also, evaluate results with a pinch of salt, understanding that there are several dynamics at play. And I don't want to come down hard on local organizations, but I've observed several of them long enough to know that not everybody has the same level of, commitment to actually transforming, transformative ideas around peace. And therefore, this element of horizontal learning becomes quite difficult within country context. But perhaps what is easier is if we build those systems so that country level learning, flows into headquarters better. And there's better coordination between headquarters and country offices. And then there is knowledge exchange between headquarters of different organizations. I think encouraging local level learning is important, but we cannot always, because of the different political and cultural dynamics at play, we may not always be successful in encouraging that kind of horizontal sharing of knowledge. And that is one of my observations. But overall, I thoroughly enjoyed sharing this platform with you and learning from you.
Thank you so much, Sukanya. And Jason and Patricia for the comments. I have lots of thoughts about this. Sukanya has heard me speak about it before, but I wanted to give a chance to our audience to ask questions as well. If I can ask you that if you're asking a question, that you turn on your, if possible, I understand that sometimes it might be difficult, but to the extent possible, to turn on your camera so Sukanya can see who's speaking to her. But also tell us who you are. So that we all know you're sort of where you're coming from. If you're a student, if you're a peace building NGO worker, and so on. So I will open that up to the audience for some questions. Anybody? Otherwise, I'm just going to monopolize things. So
I think Agnieszka and I can speak about this for many hours.
Exactly. No, because let me maybe start off as I really encourage people who are here in the audience to ask questions, but I wanted to emphasize a couple points that I think are so important that you make here and that came up in this discussion. And one is the importance of context, right? Which on one level is so trite and like, well, of course, but so often we don't see it actually happening in the kind of work that is being done on the ground, that lessons learned in one place are being transmitted to another without considering how that broader context impacts what it is that you are doing. And I think the example that you use in your study of the Mosaic program and how the impacts of that longer term impacts of that program were so predicated on the kind of context in which they were happening in communities where there was so little communal cross ties between different ethnic groups, religious groups, and so on. This really didn't have as much of an impact long term, because once kids left the program, they were back in this very segmented kind of environment. On the other hand, where these relationships existed, that impact was very different. And I think it's, and again, it's very hard to implement, but I think it's a really important point that you make, thinking about that broader context and what kind of programming actually will be impactful given that context. And that in many ways, when Jason was talking about conflict sensitivity and evaluations and conflict assessments, the other challenge that I see is that, often for reasons of resources, of time, conflict assessments are done at a country level. Yes, there's some regional, right? You go to different regions of a country, you take that into consideration, but that very often a program is designed for the country, right? Rather than saying, well, since Liberia was on one of your photographs, right? The Voinjama, what is happening in Voinjama in Lofa County is quite different than what's happening in Maryland County or Grand Cru County, right? And how do we take these very local conditions into account as we do programming? And I think that's really a huge challenge that I don't think we fully solved, frankly. But I just wanted to put that out there. The other point I'll just make, as Jason was talking about conflict sensitivity, is that one of the things that I found working in a variety of places is when you get outside of the peace building community, the notions of conflict sensitivity often are not particularly comprehensible. Right. So speaking to people building irrigation systems or building infrastructure like bridges or health clinics, right, and say, but this matters for your work as well. And I don't think we've quite figured out how to solve that problem, right? How to there's a lot of course, written on conflict sensitive infrastructure and education and healthcare systems and so on. But how to convince people on the ground in donor agencies or NGOs that are working as subcontractors, why actually being conflict sensitive matters for their work, right? And what does it mean? And I often found that this was honestly kind of gibberish to a lot of people. And so I just wanted to put that out there as well.
And also, the actors in the conflict, whether they are actors, armed actors, for example, who have been demobilized or who have lost a conflict or who've been integrated into a military, their access to political power in a post-war setting determines so much in terms of, again, just access generally to infrastructure, to various social benefits, if any, in these countries, and also to peace-building programs. There's a certain parts of the country, think about South Sudan, which are still not accessible properly. And we are, reliant on helicopters, few and far between, or which charge you enormous amounts of money to be able to go into these communities. So what is happening is often the more accessible communities geographically become overloaded with multiple organizations working in the same area, while there are areas where, like Harper, for example, Maryland, which was much more difficult to get to, you had to take a flight to get to Harper, while, Bong County or something close to Monrovia, the capital, was much easier, and you had so many little NGOs, mushrooming and working around these things. These are really important, points to consider as to how far even we are able to reach the, the right people.
Thank you.
I think Peter has a question. Peter has his hand up.
Oh, wonderful. Peter, please.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I thought good discussion. Couple things, as Jason said, resonated with me. I'm Peter Joyce. I guess I would call myself a friend of the Calder School and also a neighbor. I live a block away, but I just returned from a stint with USAID in East Africa, and working particularly around youth. And organizing youth within the political structure and outside the political structure. So that's really kind of my question I'd like to hear. I know that, Patricia, you mentioned the reference to adults versus children and kind of an approach or an attitude. I'm curious from all of you, from your research efforts, the role of youth within the peace process and whether there's some promise there or not.
Thank you, Peter.
Shall I take that, Agnieszka?
Sure. Yeah, and then Patricia can jump in as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this question. It's such an important one. At an international level, there's this push for mainstreaming, as I would call it, youth mainstreaming. This is the second step following gender mainstreaming. So we've had the Women, Peace and Security resolution and agenda and national action plans. Now we have a very similar sort of mimicking of agendas with youth, peace and security. And 2025 will be 10 years since the resolution 2250 was passed by the UN and sponsored by Jordan. But in short, what we see is that there's a much more top-down push on peace-building organizations and peace-building actors and national governments to adopt a youth-sensitive programming approach, which is inclusive of youth voices, and there's an involvement of young people in these projects and programs, and also in terms of their political participation, civic participation, partly because many of these countries have seen sort of intergenerational tensions, particularly in gerontocratic contexts in West Africa, in various parts of Africa, where elders have often held power, resources, access, and and young people have been reliant on clientelism and support from elders or from the rich and powerful or the big men in these societies to be able to access jobs or various political favors. But what has happened following conflict in countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, among others, is that there's been a role reversal, that young people who are able to defend certain communities as part of community defense groups, including the Kamajo militias, became quite influential and well respected. So after the war, these actors have either, transitioned into civil society actors, with their own NGOs, or they have become quite active in the political space. In fact, several civil society actors are now standing in elections because, they use their performance as peace builders who stand for elections. And I know of first-hand examples, at least in Liberia. But in short, what is happening is that there's also this resistance of the reversal. One of the papers I recently wrote about Sierra Leone in the Journal of Modern African Studies, it's about land, and it's about these land conflicts in parts of Sierra Leone. There's a lot has been written about land grabs in different parts of the world, but also in Sierra Leone. But the fact that in certain pockets, despite resistance that young people found actually being aligned with the large land, or the MNCs who were grabbing land, and with politicians or chiefs, was actually beneficial in the long term for their employment prospects. That being resistant to the corporatization of land is actually more negative. So although initially, normatively, in terms of children's rights or youth empowerment, there was resistance from elders, over time, if we observe, there's actually a certain level of acquiescence, sort of falling in line with the system. And that is something that I have observed. But there are also examples of entrepreneurship and youth leadership and standing for elections and, really becoming more vocal in terms of change. So there are both aspects, but I don't think it's as clear-cut in terms of transition of power from one to the other.
Great, thank you. Patricia, it sounded like you had also a point you wanted to make about it.
Oh, I'm just gonna second what Sukanya has said. And youth are very interesting, and I think part of the responses in regards to the war was because they had no access to power, and they had no access to resources, and they had no, if you're working in Burundi, then I don't know if that's where you're going, but it's the lack of resources, and how do the youth navigate that space? And there's multiple ways that they do it.
I see that there's still a few people in the audience that are with us. So I wanted to give others an opportunity to ask questions. I think we probably have time for one more question before we wrap up the session. I've been reminded before we started that it's really important to end on time. But if anybody has a question that they still want to ask, or any comment that they would like to share with us, let me sort of wait for, there's somebody here. No question here, but I wanted to say many thanks. This was a lovely to listen on. Thank you very much for that comment. It's great to hear that this was useful. If anybody else also, or if somebody would like to ask a question via the chat, please feel free to do that. Another thank you from the chat that this was really great information. I agree. This was really such a rich discussion. The findings of Sukanya's study are really, I think, important. As Jason sort of mentioned, it really it gives a lot of food for thought to those of us and all of us around, I was going to say around this table, but around the Zoom, either work in peace building full time or straddle that divide quite often of being both on the academic side as well as on the more applied side quite often. And I know it gave the number of the many of the points that you make in this book, Sukanya, really made me think about sort of my own experiences and thinking about, how do we actually do that in practice? For instance, the exit strategy from the beginning. How do we think about those challenges of incorporating that into the way that programming is designed, right? Because I certainly see many examples where that wasn't a consideration, and the results were often not excellent. Let's just put it that way. Before we wrap up, I wanted to see if any of the panelists wanted to have anything to add as we wrap up.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead. No, Sukanya, you go.
No, Jason, go ahead. Sorry, no, I just was thanking Agnieszka. That's
I was just going to respond to your comment, just to say I'm in total agreement on sort of this question of localization and how localization, decolonization, that it really has to be done with care and thought and without thinking of anybody's role in a peace building ecosystem in an idealized way, because that's just a recipe for disaster. And so I 100% agree with you on that. And that's actually a challenge, because a lot of the decolonization debate is very rhetorical at this point and very sort of principles based. And that has to meet with the reality of sort of the political economies that you're dealing with. So yeah, I'd just say that. But thank you.
perhaps just by way of reflection. I know we need to close quickly, but Jason, because you're heading so many programs, what is important is also to think about the resource dynamics. As long as international actors are the ones sending resources to local actors, and there's dependence, and there's this tie, this resource tie, I think that is what is problematic. Because if it was more about decolonization in a way that local actors had to use local resources, and international actors were there to guide and mentor, their ability to apply and use local resources for conflict resolution, peace building, that would sever that kind of resource dependency. And I think the resource dependency is the key evil, in terms of how peace building often kills the good that can be done. Because, and that's just my reflection. Maybe this is impractical, but having worked for many years in many contexts, this is something that I have observed. And I'll leave it at that. I'm sure we can talk about this another time.
We have a lot to talk about there. Yes.
Well, I think we have another panel that we just need to organize, because I think it's
right.
The localization debate is such an important one, and such a complex one. I wanted to thank all of you for coming. I wanted to thank Sukanya for presenting her findings of her fascinating book. Everybody should buy it. It's really useful and interesting. And to Jason and Patricia for your comments. So thank you so much. It was a fabulous discussion, I think.
Thank you.